Good evening, everyone. Glad to be back with you again. This is the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With us today, we have Simone Ledeen. She's the former Secretary of Defense with a focus on the Middle East region. Today, we are going to be discussing a number of defense disasters in the not so great moments in US foreign policy. Has the Washington gone crazy, Simone? Because they're seeing OFAC issuing humanitarian aid licenses to the Taliban. We have Jake Sullivan traveling to the Middle East and issuing banal statements while Saudi Arabia is under attack from Houthi drones. We have the the debacle in Congress with the Iron Dome. We have President Biden and the humanitarian aid issue with Egypt, and of course we are having NDAA, which is always fun to talk about. So let's get started with the with the whole situation with the OFAC and the license to imports basically whatever is needed for the Taliban's um, own needs. And this comes, by the way, a few days after statements at the UN with Emir Tamim calling for just that measure. I don't know whether the timing is just funny or it's me, but I'm curious what you think about this.
Well, I can't speak to the timing with the with respect to the Emir, but I do think that Qatari Emir, but I do think that it is pretty outrageous, this OFAC license. And if you actually, the overall license, if you actually click on, they have a series of FAQs, which it's normal to issue the frequently asked questions with respect to the license. They actually talk about the more specific elements of what's included in this license. And in this case, actually, taxes and fees are allowed and are included under this license, which means that the Taliban are able to levy duties against, let's say, NGOs and add a Taliban tax for any humanitarian activities or humanitarian goods. And then that is explicitly allowed in the OFAC license, which I find outrageous. I was speaking with someone a while ago now on a news channel, and I referenced the fact that the Taliban remain a designated terrorist organization. And they were arguing because they're not, okay, so they're not designated under US State Department sanctions. They're not a designated terrorist organization by the State Department, but they remain designated under Executive Order 13224, and they also remain designated under the United Nations Security Council. So I think it's outrageous that we're allowing for this, really with no discussion, and especially after we heard today in testimony from the Defense Department that the Taliban did not adhere to any of the agreed upon points in the Doha Agreement. Well, one, they didn't attack U.S. forces directly, but yeah, I find the whole thing absolutely outrageous, and they're doing it in the open. I mean, they're not even trying to hide what they're doing, so it's pretty disgraceful.
Is there a limitation on how much taxes they can levy?
That wasn't included in the license, so I'm not aware of any limit.
So it sounds to me like they are basically getting an indirect cut of the money, and in other words, they can tax as much as they want, and essentially divert the humanitarian funding legally in that way without having to just
Correct.
basically
Yes.
steal it and
That's correct, and
that's what
they've done. I'm sorry, there's a delay. I don't mean to cut you off. I think
Mhm.
that's Irina, that's what they've done historically. If you look at their fundraising activities across at least the past 2 decades, they were very good at levying taxes. I mean, they derived a lot of money from our NATO ISAF logistics chains, moving food and equipment into the country, like through Pakistan and across the borders into Afghanistan. They taxed a lot of that and made a lot of money off of that, as well as taxing and eventually taking over the opium trade.
So there's a couple of things here. First, when the administration restored humanitarian aid to the Houthis in Yemen earlier, they were faced with a similar situation in that Houthis have a tendency to also extort and levy high taxes against various humanitarian packages and so forth. So the Biden administration had to have been aware that this similar practice is already being employed. And the other issue, of course, is that um, the same a representative of the Taliban said right around the same time as the OFAC license was issued that they will be restoring public executions and amputations, which is not particularly welcomed by anyone outside the Taliban circles. So I'm not really sure how they think that an organization that considers cutting off hands, to quote directly, very important, will deal with humanitarian aid for those portions of the population that are not particularly in line with the Taliban ideology.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. And for groups that are not explicitly protected by these taxes, I think they that candidly probably don't have money behind them from the West or from other countries that are engaged in activities there. I think they're I think that the future for them looks quite bleak, unfortunately.
We've been getting some very disturbing reports of the Hazara minority being under attack and physically suffering ethnic cleansing. And there's also been some reports of massive attacks in Panjshir Valley, as well as foreign mercenaries from various regions, Syria, from Chechens coming in to assist the Taliban in a crackdown internally. And I've personally seen some very disturbing pictures showing what look like mass graves and dead bodies. What can you tell us about what's going on? And it's really not being very reported very well in the media, so it's really anyone's guess what's actually happening.
Yeah, I think it really is anyone's guess unless you have access to people who are there on the ground, and they're certainly not reporters because all reporters are not there on the ground. It is very hard to get ground truth. Unfortunately, I've also seen some of the videos that you're describing. Um, you know, uh, there's there's definitely been a focused targeting of people, Panjshiris, people from the Panjshir Valley, people whose names, tribal affiliations are from Panjshir. They've had a very hard time since the Taliban have come back. Um, I think right now they want to continue this farce, this sort of mirage that they have going, that this Taliban is a new Taliban, they're more modern and they're less violent than before, but I think it's the truth is emerging now. And with respect to foreign fighters, I think this was really a seminal moment. The retreat of the Americans, our surrender, has been an incredibly motivating event for terrorist organizations. I think this is a clear victory for them. And it's been very motivating for people who may have felt demotivated after ISIS, Daesh kind of faded away and was defeated in Syria in terms of owning land. Obviously, they still pop up here and there, but and obviously in Africa, they're very strong right now. But speaking of Afghanistan and the Taliban victory, a lot of people now want to sign up for that. They want to be part of it. And recruiting, I'm sure, is going very well for them. I'm sure fundraising is going very well. I mean, this has been a seminal moment for them. And as someone who's spent a lot of her career in counterterrorism, I'm very concerned about what that means, not only for the United States, but also for the West and West kind of facing West allied countries, what we will be facing in the future.
The administration seems to have dropped the ball both on the counterterrorism and human rights front, despite being proponents of human rights, democracy, and liberalism when they took office. Not only are they not commenting on what's going on in Afghanistan with respect to these alleged and seeming violations, and there seems to be a growing body of evidence that these violations are taking on a mass scale, but they are actually issuing affirmative statements in support of various violators. John Kerry, for instance, was in an interview essentially whitewashed the genocide of the Uyghurs in China. What does that tell you about the administration's positions on human rights?
Well, I think that the administration's position on human rights is sort of tenuous at best. I think specifically with the Uyghur argument that you make, which I agree is completely a genocide. There's so much evidence to prove that statement, and it's horrendous what the world is allowing to happen to the Uyghurs. I think that John Kerry and this administration have made it clear that their priority is climate change and environmentalism, and that is a higher priority to them than anything else, including the genocide of the Uyghurs, including longstanding partnerships with countries like a country like Egypt, who they say is a human rights violator, and certainly there are concerns with, specific human rights issues and cases and how they handle some human rights issues in Egypt. But is that worth throwing away an entire relationship? Are we prioritizing that over all of the other things that we have in common that we have to work with and with them on? And then furthermore, how are we able to influence a more positive approach to human rights from some of these countries when, number one, at this point, I think we have no leg to stand on, given what we're allowing to happen to the Uyghurs, what we're allowing to happen to our friends and allies in Afghanistan. I don't really know how we can continue to, and the Biden administration can continue to push this human rights argument when everybody sees it for the kind of duplicitous statement that it really is.
I'd like to raise another concern in addition to what you just described. This military aid cut that the Biden imposed on Egypt due to these supposed human rights violations. This came as almost out of the blue in terms of the administration, but not really out of the blue in terms of the general, because he hasn't really been making too many statements about Egypt lately. But for those watching what's going on in Washington, there has been a concerted campaign by various lobby groups, most of them affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, actually 100% of them affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood in some capacity, pushing for these measures on various fronts in Congress, through the Egypt caucus, through assorted NGOs and local human rights organizations, and of course behind the scenes. So if this entire campaign is literally uh, has been the creation of a particular special interest groups with no broader considerations of U.S. interests, and if the administration is so prone to be influenced by lobbyists, isn't doesn't that raise question about corruption and outright bribery potentially?
I think that's a very interesting question that you raise. I mean, I have no specific knowledge about, a corruption and bribery angle, but there certainly is. there certainly are members of Congress, and I would put them really as responsible for the situation with Egypt right now and the reduction in aid, um, and military aid that we provide and historically have provided for decades. Um, I think there are specific members of Congress who have lobbied for this extensively, and the Biden administration on this has been less aggressive than it has been toward, let's say, Saudi Arabia, because they do realize in some way the importance of the relationship with Egypt. I think they understood it more clearly than ever when Egypt interceded in the most recent sort of Gaza uprising, crisis between Gaza and Israel. So Egypt stepped in as the mediator, whereas Qatar had been sort of, playing this sort of middleman. Egypt stepped in and negotiated a ceasefire, and I think that allowed the Biden administration to take another look at the relationship and say, actually, there is value here. I don't know why it's an unfortunate situation because there are many, many reasons why it's an important and valuable relationship. And when we look at Egypt and Egypt's geography and what it faces, both from the internal, they have an internal fight with Daesh. They still have the remnants of the Brotherhood there that they're trying to navigate, and then so many external threats as well coming from all sides. So they really do need our support. They need our help. And it's a very sad situation when you see, instead of us reaching out, us the United States reaching out our hand in friendship and partnership and working with them to address these threats, which really are shared threats. Instead, we cut our aid and cut our influence because Egypt still needs these materials. They still need support, and they're going to get it from elsewhere. And unfortunately, that reduces our influence long term, as it does in other countries that are experiencing the same.
Egypt in recent years has been increasingly diversifying the source of its high-tech arsenal, specifically from by concluding a billion-dollar deal with Italy, importing jet planes from France, and also continuing to rely on Russia for some level of imports, although Russia and Egypt have also been experiencing tensions over Ethiopia-related matters lately. So that kind of leaves Egypt in a tough bind between two kind of polar states. But nevertheless, what was the effect that the Biden administration was hoping to get by cutting this aid? Given that first of all there are other options, and second, the Egyptian government does not recognize the argument that the U.S. is making here. That, for instance, arresting and imprisoning Muslim Brotherhood members or depriving them of property. They do not see that as a human rights violation, given that Muslim Brotherhood is a designated terrorist organization there. So, how what exactly were they hoping would happen, and what has actually happened? What was Egypt's response?
Yeah, so I agree with your question. What exactly did they think would happen? It's hard for me to imagine what that answer is. I think it's incredibly naive to think we'll cut aid and they'll start to do what we want for the reasons that you mentioned. If you have a true understanding of the situation in Egypt vis-a-vis the Muslim Brotherhood, you will understand why they're doing what they're doing. Again, perhaps there are different methods that can be used in order to reduce. I apologize, my dog is making a lot of noise right now. The
Okay.
the to sort of reduce. Reduce the influence of the Brotherhood and even further, and really erase the possibility that they could they could ever have a role again in the Egyptian government. So I don't know why. I don't understand the calculus. Perhaps it's like a DC calculus thing where these certain members of Congress are so focused on this issue for whatever reason, and it's a sort of trade that was made for other things. I could see
Mm-hmm.
that as a possibility, but I don't know. Again, what was given, what was traded? I don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is that the second and third order effects of this are devastating. And the long term damage that this has done to the US Egypt relationship is incalculable. And it's not only our sort of US and Egypt watchers like myself sort of concerned, but many of our international partners who have relied on a very strong US Egypt relationship over the years, they're also deeply concerned. Countries like Israel, they don't want Egypt to get, super close to Russia. That's not helpful for them. So, um, for many reasons, this is deeply concerning. And since 2011, when the Obama administration first froze our military aid to Egypt, eventually they did release it, but it has been a long road, and um, it has been very destructive because at the end of the day, Egypt now gets a much larger percentage of its security equipment from other countries than it did before. It had to diversify because I think prior to 2011, they were convinced that nothing would ever change in terms of the US Egypt relationship. And well, they woke up to reality a long time ago, and now it just continues to get worse, unfortunately.
President Sisi has cancelled his physical appearance at the UN General Assembly session, instead sending a video message. And frankly, the Egyptian delegation, they didn't really have anyone high level to speak of. What is it in any way linked to these tensions with the Biden administration? Has there been any discussion about high level meetings?
Well, again, I don't have any insider knowledge on this, but I do think that um, there was no communication at all until Egypt brokered this Gaza-Israel ceasefire, and then President Biden called President Sisi. That was the first communication that they had, and that was well after President Biden had taken office. So, and that was viewed as a bit insulting to the Egyptian president. Um, Now, as you noted, Egypt is facing what they view as potentially an existential threat from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and they have asked both the United States, the United Nations, um, the African Union to intercede and help negotiate a solution to this situation as the Ethiopians continue to fill the dam. Um, and water insecurity, water instability is already a massive concern in Egypt, and again, they consider this to be an existential threat. So they haven't really seen, I mean, there hasn't been a ton of movement in terms of helping Egypt with this problem. I can assume that they don't want to have to take military action against Ethiopia. But if the situation continues, you're sort of reducing any other options or getting rid of any other options aside from a military one, if indeed this becomes an existential crisis for Egypt. So it's a very complicated situation. And I think the fact that all of these world leaders were in New York and President Sisi decided not to come was such a clear sign in terms of what he what he thought he would gain from coming, which really says something. Quite a statement.
And all of that comes amidst a failed coup in Sudan, which some have attributed to an attempt by Islamist military contingent to take power back, while others are seeing as a sign of a deteriorating ethnic tribalist kind of situation and a sign of fragility at the top level. There's been not really much from the administration on that front. There's also been Sudan has also been kind of cast aside during the post Abraham Accords period. What and it's a very important country in this whole in the trilateral situation between Egypt, Ethiopia, in that region. So what exactly is happening? Why has there been such a non-response by the administration to these very disturbing developments and that kind of threaten the stability in the entire region and not just Sudan itself?
Well, one can only surmise that they haven't prioritized this in terms of where they want to focus. I know they've appointed Jeffrey Feltman, Ambassador Feltman, as an envoy. I know he's done a lot of travel recently, and I hope that something comes of it, but who knows really? Who knows if he will achieve any kind of success diplomatically? I do think it is incredibly problematic that Sudan, who did normalize relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords, has not really reaped any benefits from that relationship and from that action, which was very gutsy for them. Um, I know that there are efforts to change that and to start, to help Sudan with some agricultural efforts and other things that they really need help with. So I hope that that starts to bear fruit. Um, yeah, there was a coup attempt, and my understanding is the same as yours. It was really driven by Islamists to try to take over the country. Thankfully, it did not succeed. And I hope that, part of the Sudanese partnership with Israel, UAE, other countries will really help them as well to better identify what what the kind of charge points are there, and how to sort of focus on improving some of these sort of warm areas that if you just sort of light a match nearby, something will explode. They need help, and again, they haven't really taken sides in this Ethiopia Egypt discussion. I mean, I think at the end of the day, they have to side with Egypt because the filling of the dam also influences and potentially affects their water access as well. But they're not in a position to do anything about it, and they know that. So they want peace, they want stability, they want help to grow and improve their situation. Um, and it might not be the United States that helps them, but hopefully their other new partner countries will step in and provide that. I think one of the things that we've learned under the Biden administration is don't count on the United States. I hate to say this as somebody who is a very proud American, but you know, don't count on the United States right now. It's a very volatile time, and I think we've seen, unfortunately, some really really poor and really terrifying decisions. And hopefully, other countries will step up like they are and provide leadership.
Before we get to the one of the another basically clusters of bad decision making, to put it diplomatically, related to the whole Irodome spectacle that we that we observe. We are seeing a really strange inconsistency by the administration in terms of who they get to attack, and who gets who gets support and who doesn't. For instance, there's been issue statement expressing concern about Tunisia kicking out Qatar-backed Islamists from office. Meanwhile, Algeria's severed relations with Morocco seems to be bringing the situation to the brink of war, and there's been kind of silence on that front from the administration, as well as, and all of that was based on completely dubious excuses that really don't have any grounding behind them. And then there's been silence from Biden and his team on that front, and there's been no concern expressed whatsoever, nor pressure on Algeria to kind of step away from the brink. How do you interpret this very strange lack of, very strange pattern of disinterest um, in some countries, well, and concern over all the wrong issues in other places?
Well, I think whenever you see a special focus on Israel in a negative way, it raises other questions as well in terms of motivation. Um, I think that I think that it is in some ways, well, on the left, at least in America, this BDS, anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian um, movement has been successful on the left and on the left alone, and especially in the far left. There really is a narrative um, that supports this fallacious, this fallacy that Human Rights Watch published, that Israel is an apartheid state, and this is the greatest human rights injustice of our time. Um, that's a narrative that was created for a specific reason and supports a very specific outcome. Um, and when an American administration supports such an sort of outrageous position, it really causes one to sort of ask questions about why that's the case, and who is influencing that inside of the administration, to the exclusion of all of these other very real and pressing challenges that you've noted. Um, it is odd. It is quite odd, and it is quite disturbing.
So moving now to the whole, more specifically to the issue with the Iron Dome, we have seen some politicians become quite vocal in essentially even being ready to sacrifice their own interest in the U.S. infrastructure bill because they were so concerned about the defense, um, supposedly the defense spending on the Iron Dome, and what a horrific thing that was. Now, for years, we've had some people from libertarian circles deride any sort of military aid to anybody whatsoever for any reason, and basically saying, "Oh, Israel and other countries, they get free money from the U.S." That's really not the case, and I don't know whether these individuals understand that or not, but um, at stake was not just Israel's own security, but U.S. interests in this matter uh, that essentially harken back to U.S. security interests in joint development of improved types of weapons. So, how would you assess the situation where Congress has been brought to this point, and it's even as Democrats are concerned about losing the midterms next year?
Well, I think it was a disgrace that the House leadership allowed the Iron Dome provision, replenishment provision, to be stripped out of that bill. I think it was outrageous and appalling. And there were a lot of Democrats who felt the same way, and they really raised an alarm. And obviously, there was a separate bill and a vote, and everything's okay. But everything is not okay. And I think the whatever you want to call them, the squad, the very far left progressives who championed this and voted against the provision, I think they achieved their goal, which was to put more focus on the issue. And you can be sure that this is not going away. The facts, which are the Iron Dome is a joint Israeli-U.S. project, that it's not a gift, that it's something that benefits all of us. We now have an Iron Dome here in the United States, for example, and we're hoping to have more soon. That's not something that ever came up and was it really ever discussed publicly for a reason. Nor was the fact that this provision is specifically intended to support replenishment of the weapons that the Iron Dome deploys when there are rockets that are sent into Israeli cities. This is a defensive um, this is the Iron Dome is defensive in nature. It is not meant to attack anything except for rockets that are headed for urban areas in Israel, or populations of any kind. And as people have said many times, it protects both Israelis, and Palestinians, Arabs, of whoever's there. And many Israeli cities, as we've seen, they're not inhabited just by Israelis, but by Palestinians as well. And so it's a completely ignorant argument. It was just another excuse, another reason to shine the spotlight on Israel and on the narrative that Israel is an apartheid state, which which obviously is not true. And it's not going to go away. I mean, so this was this one provision was knocked off, and everything was approved, and it was overwhelmingly approved, and that's wonderful. We got some great statements out of even Democrat members of Congress, but at the same time, it should never have been allowed to get that far. It was an it was an outrageous attempt by a small number of members of Congress that really had an outsized influence, and got way too close to achieving their goal.
Speaking of outsized influence, these individuals we are seeing they are not really foreign policy experts. They are coming from a highly ideological point of view. How much impact can they have on U.S. Israel foreign relations? And what do you think they are the future of the Democratic Party? And to add to that, why do you think the Abraham Accords did not kill the apartheid narrative, given the number of Arabs from other countries now traveling to Israel and testifying to the conditions there?
Well, to answer the last part of your question first, I think it's because a lot of people aren't educated, and so when you have like a Human Rights Watch or progressive members of the House talking about those issues in that way, people don't actually know the truth because they just haven't bothered to educate themselves in many
Mhm.
cases, unfortunately. And a lot of these members are popular. They're successful within popular culture, and unfortunately, that means that they get a lot of attention, and they can use that attention. They turn that's their platform. That they use to address a multitude of issues, but including a very strong anti-Israel and in some cases anti-Semitic position. And so I think it's very damaging and very unfortunate. And I also think there are a lot of people around here who say, well, now that's over with. And I don't think long term it is over with. I think they actually feel motivated by the fact that they got so much attention put on Israel again. And they're going to keep doing it. What was the first part of your question again, Arena? I don't recall.
Um, yeah, I was basically trying to figure out why hasn't the narrative really, like, why hasn't the Abraham Accords been more of a disruption on BDS and
Oh yeah.
anti-Israel efforts, given, and do you think that the members, that the participants in this treaty are doing a good job reaching people outside the choir, so to speak?
I mean, I think actually, ironically, outside the United States, the Abraham Accords have done a great deal to, because it's a lot of it's about people to people. So maybe people
Mm-hmm.
who hadn't really met an Israeli before, didn't really understand what the country was about. They can now visit. They now have Israelis in their lives that they can speak to. It's changed a lot, and it shows by the number of, like, for example, Israel UAE, how many new businesses have been formed in the last year? I mean, the figures are astounding in terms of the trade, amount of trade going on between the two countries. I mean, this is a lot of us were aware of the kind of quiet friendship that the two
Mm-hmm.
countries shared for a while, but I don't think any of us could have imagined the scale, that the scale of how quickly the scale changed in terms of these trade relationships, and it speaks to something I think more profound. So I think the problem is, here, and really the Corbynization of the Democratic Party, and the fact that as the Democratic Party has moved farther and farther left, it's incorporating more and more an anti-Semitic tone, um, that is concerning, because anti-Semitism should be something that both parties abhor, and both parties work to fight against. And if there's one party in the out of two in the United States that's sort of tacitly supporting an anti-Semitic position, that's very scary, as the United States has the second largest number of Jews in the world after Israel.
Speaking of very strange developments related to anti-Semitism, we are seeing an effort by three leading senators to curtail presidential powers, with the effect of specifically making it harder to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel. And we are seeing Bernie Sanders, Chris Murphy, who are somewhat less of a surprising partners in this coalition. More surprising is Senator Mike Lee, who is by no means an anti-Israeli lunatic. So, how do you? I understand the argument about narrowing presidential powers, war powers, and reviewing congressional role, but is this the right? Is this legislative effort, the right way to go? And isn't there a high level of potential backfire related to focusing so much on these countries?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is, you know, in the most recent NDAA, the House passed this amendment which now ends the logistical support, maintenance, and sustainment of Saudi airplanes involved in strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. Like, the problem in Yemen is the Saudis. I mean,
Mhm.
what about the
I
Houthis?
just,
They still think that the stopping this very small amount of continuing aid to the Saudis is somehow going to bring the Houthis to the negotiating table. I mean, it's absurd. It really is not reality based. And the fact of the matter is, oh, and also the amendment also blocks funding for sharing intelligence with the Saudis, that would enable coalition airstrikes. The whole point of which was to help make their strikes more accurate in order to avoid civilian casualties. And our military had worked closely with them in like training and support so that they could do a better job and avoid these sort of civilian catastrophes. So um, did this cause a change in Houthi behavior? Absolutely not. The Houthis only want a military victory. They have shown this for years, and they are now so close to achieving this victory. Why would this ever influence anything other than emboldening them further, causing Iran to provide even more support because they're so close to this victory that they fought for many years now?
The
It's
Houthis
it's
seem to
uh
be
it's
one
it's
city.
appalling.
The Houthis seem to be one city away from having a clear path to the takeover of the south of Yemen, which would bring them directly to Saudi borders. There's been discussions that perhaps some of the Muslim Brotherhood contingent inside the country has been facilitating that. Leaving that internal argument aside, it's the administration has focused on the diplomatic process. The Houthis have refused to meet with Americans, have derided the process, have rejected multiple outreach efforts by the Arab coalition, have repeatedly rejected every effort at mediation, at a discussion of any politically inclusive issue, perhaps because they feel that they don't need to if they are going to eventually take it over anyway. How do you see the US role in this catastrophic scenario? I understand that the administration has been focused on getting some possibility over nuclear deal with Iran, but that can't possibly be the only explanation for this bizarre behavior of giving Yemen away to a completely fanatical US hating group with increasingly sophisticated capabilities that can now reach Israel, UAE, and other countries, not just Saudi Arabia and Yemeni citizens.
Um, I think it's precisely the reason. I think their irrational desire to return to the JCPOA, despite all the Iranian signals that they could not care less, is precisely the reason why they, month one in office, Biden canceled the Houthi terrorist designation. The only reason for that was the JCPOA. And the more that they give away the Biden administration in this desperate and frankly pathetic attempt to return to an agreement that was never followed by the Iranians. Um, it's just they're just digging. They just keep digging. The old phrase like, once you hit bottom, don't keep digging. They continue to dig.
Mhm.
Where is bottom? It's very hard to ascertain where that will be, unfortunately. So yes, they will continue to do things like this that they think will somehow affect an agreement, which I think we've seen that it won't. Frankly, it's terrifying. I mean, I'm sure that our long-term allies and friends in the region are terrified because they see what's happening. I think they see clearly what's happening in most cases, and it's a long 3 years ahead.
I am actually currently reporting from Geneva, where one of the first things that I learned upon hitting the ground, so to speak, was the impending execution of 9 civilians, including a minor, which took place literally the day after I arrived. There's been some statements of condemnation issued by the State Department, by the UN, and so forth, but no action has been taken to penalize anyone for a completely egregious act following over 3 years of systematic torture, which resulted in that minor who was arrested when he was 14 being paralyzed and not being able to stand at his execution. The optics were absolutely devastating. How can we? How can the administration possibly justify anything of that sort and not take even minor action to at least hold a few people accountable?
How can juxtapose that with how they've cut aid to Egypt based on human rights concerns? What human rights concerns can they possibly voice in Egypt where they have allowed this atrocity to occur? And similar atrocities happen, pretty regularly in Yemen. And this whole appalling concept of child soldiers, how the Houthis are famous for enlisting child soldiers, brainwashing these poor Yemeni children into fighting for them. I mean, it's appalling. And I think all kind of human rights focused people, I think humanity should be outraged by this. It is an affront to humanity what we are allowing to happen. And this administration, again, talks out of both sides of its mouth. On the one hand, very concerned about human rights. On the other hand, allowing these atrocities to continue and not only not do anything about it, but actually reward and come back to um, a table, really a one-sided table. They're the only ones at that negotiating table, but continue to offer more and more and more. It's just it's insulting, I think, to all freedom-minded people, and certainly the people of Yemen who've suffered so much.
And from everything I'm hearing, the negotiations in Vienna are not only not going well, but Iran has rejected the visit by inspectors from IAEA and has produced mendacious information and blocked any information regarding its facilities and has been increasingly recalcitrant, even more so than at the very start. So, what exactly is the calculus here? What does the administration hoping will change as a result of these endless concessions that hasn't up until this point?
They want a deal. They want a deal. I think that no matter what happens, I honestly at this point cannot envision a scenario where they will not um, still throw out what they think is some other carrot that would bring Iran back to the table. Why should Iran come back to the table? I mean, they're in a position of strength. Why would they what would motivate them to give anything up at this point? They don't need to. Um, and that's the same situation, by the way, with the Houthis and the I would say also, by the way, we didn't talk about this, but the Iran-backed militias in Iraq. I mean, they're all
Mhm.
operating a position of strength now. What on earth would make the United States and the United States administration believe that any of them would want to negotiate with us? To achieve what? They've already largely accomplished what they want, or there's a clear road ahead in order to do so.
Do you think the US withdrawal from Iraq is next?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. It depends on the situation in Syria and what the administration wants to do there. I think if they want to remain in Syria, they have to remain in Iraq. So I think time will tell, and maybe that's yet another lever they're trying to use with the Iranians, that we'll leave Syria if you XYZ. So anything's possible, I think, unfortunately.
We are seeing we are hearing the talk of potential uh, de desanctioning of the Assad regime in Syria. So it does seem to be like they're kind of building on Obama's fake red line there and kind of
I
taking it
do
a step
think it is
further.
sort of an Yeah, I do think there's sort of inexorable movement in that direction. Um, and I agree with you. I can easily see that happening um, in the future. And yeah,
I mean, it's
certainly.
kind of ironic because Assad himself did not particularly. Uh, the reason for his survival was not such a great performance in his capacity, but because the situation ended up being so splintered by so many different interests. So he may not have had survived had the situation not gone out of control on the other end that had nothing to do with his ability to manage it. But here we are facing the potential for complete normalization and seeing Assad back in the White House at some point, even. So, speaking of these really disturbing developments, you mentioned some of the uh, new amendments to the NDA that went under the radar in the media, probably for good reason. And what else is worth noting that we are not hearing about, but we should probably take into consideration for the near future from this massive bill?
Well, I mean, I think for the Middle East region, to me, the most notable is this amendment ending the logistical support to Saudi-led coalition, and the fact that that decision actually overrules last week's prospective approval by the State Department of a $500 million agreement for the same funding of Saudi aircraft. So I think that was shocking, and I'm sure that it was shocking to the Saudis as well. And I expect them to, to seek alternative defense agreements in the wake of this, of our withdrawal from the region. More generally, I think they're going to consider China. I think they're going to consider Russia and possibly Israel as well. I think that those three countries are probably most likely, the most likely partners for Saudi for a new defense pact. I think this is probably the final nail in the coffin, and they're just going to move on. And I'm
We've
not
seen.
saying that the entire defense relationship is destroyed, but the
Mhm.
partnership that we've shared over many decades now, an important partnership, and it's been an important kind of wall against Iran, frankly, is really, I think it's over. I think now it's just it will be a relationship of kind of mutual needs, but not a friendship the way that it was.
We've seen some very disturbing developments related on that to that front. We've seen Saudi foreign minister meet directly with the Iranian foreign minister for the first time in a very long time, and the fact that there was such a high-level public meeting with no concessions from Iran towards Saudi Arabia whatsoever is in itself speaks for itself. The other issue is Saudis, Egypt, and Qatar are joining a Russia and China-led alliance focused on Central Asia. Another issue that the U.S. should probably be concerned about. The trajectory really seems to be favoring US adversaries and their influence in the region. I can't imagine Israel being happy about these developments either. Frankly, while Saudis may seem to be, continuing some level of defense operations with Israel, I don't see public normalization coming anytime soon. Speaking of the Saudis, though, the administration has made in the past statements claiming that they do not wish to deal with the crown prince. Now we have Jake Sullivan in Saudi Arabia meeting with him, while after a completely failed effort by Secretary Austin to gain any meetings in the defense whatsoever, or anyone for that matter in Saudi Arabia, on the one hand, this seems to be kind of a diplomatic loss for the United States, if that's what you know. You, if at the very least it's a loss of face. But on the other hand, what has actually come from this meeting? While Sullivan was there, we've seen additional Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia, and we've seen no real pushback from Sullivan other than the usual kind of statements. What was the purpose of that visit? What has been achieved, and why is the administration even bothering at this point, given that they're not really giving Saudis anything that they would want, and there's not much to gain if this is how we are going to be about it.
Well, actually, my understanding is there's a rather important diplomatic row that occurred that ended in Secretary Austin being disinvited from a visit, and that had to do with the Defense Department's removal of the THAAD system from Saudi Arabia. I believe, my understanding at least, is that once that was decided and announced that that Secretary Austin was no longer welcome in Saudi Arabia. So that was, after several Patriot systems were removed, um, some of which happened in the last administration. But I think ultimately, once that happened, that was the last straw for them. So I think perhaps one can surmise that Jake Sullivan went out there as a result of Secretary Austin being disinvited, to make sure
Mm-hmm.
that more broadly there were still the two countries maintain relations. But I do also think, given the recent meeting between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the very strong desire for that the administration has to continue with the JCPOA, perhaps the conversation also included that. You know, I agree with you. It's pretty clear that full normalization, like Saudi Arabia signing on to the Abraham Accords, will not happen tomorrow, but they are inching slowly in that direction. And I do believe that ultimately it is inevitable that they will join the Abraham Accords and they will normalize with Israel. And so I hope, I'm not optimistic about anything this administration
Mm-hmm.
does, pardon
Mm-hmm.
me, but I
That's
do
for sure.
hope that that was something that they discussed as well. Um,
Do you think the Abraham Accords? I'm not going to say that they will survive because there are too many other interests besides Iran already being developed, trade, educational, and so forth. But do you think its original purpose in countering Iran will actually be achieved given the lack of support by the United States and 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 other challenges? Iran seems to have a growing role in the region. The some of the Bahrain and UAE are kind of small. They have good they're important allies, but they are small. And I'm not really sure. I mean, the alliance was supposed to grow with more and more countries joining, but now Biden's administration has sort of put a freeze on that. What is the trajectory here?
I do think that if they were going to break apart, they would have done already, especially with
Mm-hmm.
the Gaza crisis that we talked about earlier. So I think they're quite strong, and that has surprised some people. Not me, by the way, but I know it has surprised
Mm-hmm.
some people. Um, I do I do think it's important to note, however, that the Abraham Accords weren't just about Iran, but also about
Mm-hmm.
China, um,
Mm-hmm.
and creating partnerships where, especially in the area of technology development, Israel is a leader in that area, and especially with specialized technology like water desalination that Israel has come up with, you know, that sort of technology is helpful across the region, obviously, and especially as water instability becomes an increasing problem. So I do think it's important to note that. Um, I think the part of the United States goal in kind of encouraging these relationships to come out into public view was to try to supplant the growing influence of China in the Middle East, because a lot of people don't understand that there's not a division like in other countries between the economic sector, um, the commercial sector, and the defense security sector. In China, it's all the same thing. And there's still some educating that needs to happen in terms of what that means in terms of partnering with China and what you might get on the front end, and then what they might be slipping in the back end. So there are some partners in the region who understand that, and there are some who either don't or don't care. But we can look to Europe and Southeast Asia for examples of other countries who have made deals with China and are deeply regretting that now and are trapped. So
Unfortunately, so
I think,
far, as the US influence in the Middle East seems to be waning, not just because of Biden, but especially because of Biden and his policies, we are seeing China playing a growing role. Even Israel is operating a China owned port. Saudi Arabia has signed a number of major deals quite publicly with China, despite its strong support for Iran. UAE, we have seen a great deal of Chinese movement there. Some of its vaccine diplomacy has failed, but not everyone is willing to admit it. And even Morocco is signing on to new deals with China, even as is hoping to develop stronger relationships with the United States at this time. So, not really sure that we are quite successful on that front. I am
we're
kind of
not.
concerned.
We're
As I
not.
said, I don't think Abraham Accords will break up because there's no reason for countries that are getting, trade and other advantages from the relationship to go their separate ways and shut down diplomatic relationships. But I do think they are limited in what can be achieved thanks to these major power struggles. Well, that's been a very bleak discussion. Unfortunately, I hope we'll find a way from. I hope the Biden team will somehow wake up. I'm not optimistic that it will, but I will always hope that that something will click at some point and they'll realize that this is not not a way to kind of blindly meander and stumble through life. But that's my hope. But thank you so much for being with us today and giving us insights on these issues which haven't gotten nearly enough attention or in-depth coverage in the media. And hopefully we'll be talking soon about much better developments for the US and its allies in the near
I
future.
look forward to
Uh,
it. Thank you so much.
Thank you and have a great night. See you next week.